My husband thought I was gone. The baby monitor recorded his biggest secret. I want to start by saying I didn't go looking for proof that night. I went looking for peace of mind, which is a very different thing. And I didn't expect the difference between those two things to matter as much as it ended up mattering. My name is Priya, and for the 11 months leading up to that Tuesday night, I'd been living with a specific low-grade unease. I couldn't fully name the kind that doesn't announce itself as suspicion. Exactly. Just a persistent sense that something in my marriage had shifted slightly out of alignment. My husband, Dorian, had become harder to read in small ways. Phone screen turned face down more often than it used to be. A new habit of taking calls in the garage instead of the kitchen. Longer showers after he got home from work, as though he were washing something off before he was ready to be fully present with me and our 9-month-old daughter, Isla. I told myself repeatedly that new parenthood strained every marriage. That exhaustion made people withdraw in ways that looked more sinister than they actually were. I believed that story for 11 months, mostly because I badly wanted it to be true. That Tuesday, I told Dorian I was taking Isla to my sister's for the evening. A plan we'd actually discussed a week earlier. Nothing invented, nothing suspicious on its face. I packed a bag, buckled Isla into her car seat, and made a show of leaving, loud enough for him to hear the front door close firmly behind me. I didn't go to my sister's. I sat in my car in our driveway for 11 minutes, Isla fussing quietly in her car seat, working up the nerve to do something I'd never seriously considered before that night. I opened the app connected to Isla's nursery baby monitor, a camera, and microphone we'd installed near her crib. Still active, still broadcasting from a room just off our kitchen, and I listened. I want to be honest that I felt sick doing it. Some part of me still hoping I'd hear nothing but the ordinary sounds of an empty house, that I'd feel foolish afterward for doubting a man I'd loved for 9 years. That hope lasted about 4 minutes. I heard Dorian's voice first, warmer and lighter than I'd heard it directed at me in months. Laughing at something in a way that landed in my chest, like a physical blow. Then a woman's voice, coming through what I recognized after a moment as a video call. He'd apparently walked into the kitchen, close enough to the monitor's range, thinking the house was empty and no one was listening. "I miss you already," the woman said. "This week's been impossible without seeing you properly." "I know," Dorian said, and I will never forget the specific tenderness in his voice, because it was a tenderness I hadn't heard directed at me since before Isla was born. "I'm sorry. Priya took the baby to her sister's tonight. I've got maybe 3 hours before I need to seem normal again." I sat in that driveway, engine off, my daughter fussing softly in the back seat, and listened to my husband make plans with a woman named Genevieve, a colleague. I'd learn later, from a project he'd been working closely with for the better part of a year while believing, with total confidence, that I was somewhere across town and completely unaware. I didn't storm back inside. I want to be honest about that too, because I know the version of this story that would feel more satisfying is the one where I marched through the front door and confronted him immediately, righteous and furious. That's not what happened. I sat frozen in my car for nearly 20 minutes, Isla eventually settling into a fussy half-sleep behind me, listening to enough of that conversation to understand that this wasn't a single lapse, wasn't a moment of weakness I could reasonably attribute to stress or confusion. It was established, comfortable, familiar in a way that told me, with sickening clarity, that this had been going on for considerably longer than 11 months of vague unease had suggested. I drove to my sister's that night, exactly as I'd told Dorian I would, and I sat on her couch after Isla finally fell asleep and told her everything, my voice shaking through most of it. My sister, to her enormous credit, didn't tell me what to do. She simply held my hand and let me cry until I'd emptied out enough of the shock to start thinking clearly again. I didn't confront Dorian that night, or even the next day. I spent nearly a week gathering myself, quietly documenting what I could screenshots of the specific timestamp on the monitor app, notes on what I'd overheard, dates that, once I started paying closer attention, lined up disturbingly well with months of small absences I'd previously excused. I wanted to walk into that conversation from a position of clarity rather than raw devastation, because I understood, even in the depth of that shock, that how I handled the next conversation would matter enormously. For what came after it, both for me and, more importantly, for Isla. When I finally sat Dorian down, a week later, I didn't yell. I told him, calmly, exactly what I'd heard that Tuesday night. Exactly when. Exactly what he'd said to Genevieve, while believing our house was empty. I watched every trace of color leave his face as he understood, in real time, that there was no version of this conversation where denial was still an option. He didn't deny it. I'll give him that much credit. Even now, he didn't insult me further by trying to talk his way around evidence that's specific. What followed instead was a long, difficult unraveling of the truth, an affair that had started 9 months earlier, not 11, overlapping with the earliest, most exhausted weeks of Isla's infancy. When I'd been drowning in sleepless nights and recovery and had, without realizing it, needed him more than I ever had before or since. I'm not trying to excuse it, he said at one point. And to be fair to him, he genuinely didn't seem to be. I just don't have a version of the truth that makes this okay. I made a choice repeatedly, for months, and I have to live with what that choice actually was. We separated within the month. I won't pretend the process that followed was simple or dignified. Divorce rarely is. Especially with a 9-month-old daughter caught in the middle of decisions. Neither of us had wanted to make this early into her life. But I've come, in the year and a half since, to a particular kind of clarity about that Tuesday night that I didn't expect to find. I think often about how easily that entire truth could have stayed buried. If I hadn't sat in that driveway, if I hadn't opened that app on impulse, more out of anxious habit than any real expectation of finding something, I think about how many more months or years I might have spent building a life on top of something that wasn't real. The way Callum, a friend of mine, actually, going through something eerily similar around the same time, once described his own experience of discovering the truth. Too late to build anything honest from what remained. I don't regret listening that night, even though the 11 minutes sitting in that driveway before I pressed play on the app were some of the most frightened minutes of my life. I'd rather have the truth, however devastating, than keep raising my daughter inside a story that was never actually true. Isla is almost 2 now. She doesn't remember any of it. Obviously, too young to carry the weight of a Tuesday night that reshaped her parents' entire relationship to each other. Dorian and I have built something functional since then, careful, businesslike, entirely focused on co-parenting her well, which I've come to understand is its own kind of accomplishment, even carved out of something that broke as badly as our marriage did. I keep that baby monitor still, mounted in Isla's new room in the apartment I've built for the 2 of us since, not for the reason it once served. There is no husband left to secretly monitor, no marriage left to protect through vigilance. I keep it because it does now exactly what it was always supposed to do. It lets me hear my daughter breathing safely in the next room. Nothing more complicated than that. And some nights, that simple, honest purpose feels like its own quiet kind of healing. The end.